It started innocently, as so many things do. Claire spent her evenings curled up on the couch with her laptop, chatting with strangers in online forums while her husband, Tom, busied himself with his hobbies in the garage. Over time, her casual conversations with one particular man, someone who went by the username Tonight, grew more frequent and flirtatious. Claire never thought it would escalate beyond harmless words on a screen. She felt neglected by Tom, who often seemed more interested in his tools and projects than in her. What started as playful banter with a stranger turned into long, intimate chats and eventually video calls. She confided in Tonight, sharing frustrations about her marriage, dreams she'd set aside, and vulnerabilities she hadn't even voiced to Tom. Tom had noticed a change in Claire. She was more distracted, her laughter sounded hollow, and she spent more time glued to her laptop than engaging with him. One night, after a particularly cold exchange at dinner, Tom decided to investigate. While Claire was asleep, Tom accessed her laptop. She hadn't bothered to log out. What he found made his heart race with anger and betrayal. The messages between Claire and Tonight were explicit and emotional, filled with promises and plans that cut deeper than any physical affair could. To Tom, this wasn't just cheating online. It was a full-blown betrayal of their life together. The next day, Tom confronted her. The argument was explosive, filled with accusations, denials, and tears. Claire insisted it wasn't real, that she had never met Tonight and never intended to. But Tom couldn't hear her through the roaring in his ears. His pride, his trust, and his sense of control had been shattered. For the next week, the tension was unbearable. Tom grew increasingly paranoid, convinced Claire was still talking to her online lover. One night, when she stepped out of the room to take a phone call, Tom followed her. Hearing her hushed voice and seeing the telltale glow of her phone in the dark sent him over the edge. Tom stormed into the room, grabbed her phone, and saw Tonight's name on the screen. Something inside him snapped. Without thinking, he ran to the garage, grabbed his handgun, and returned to find Claire still pleading with him to calm down. The neighbors heard the gunshot before the argument ended. When the police arrived, Tom was sitting on the floor, the gun beside him, and Claire's lifeless body a few feet away. He kept muttering, "She lied to me. She cheated on me." In the aftermath, investigators uncovered the full extent of Claire's online relationship. Tonight was a man from another state, someone she had never met in person. To Claire, it may have been an escape, a fantasy. But to Tom, it was as real as any betrayal could be. The tragedy left the community in shock. Friends and family wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Could words on a screen destroy a marriage? And when does jealousy turn into something irreversible? For Tom, there would be no going back. Only a lifetime to reckon with the weight of his actions. In the months following the tragedy, Tom's trial became a media spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as a man consumed by rage and jealousy, unable to distinguish between a virtual betrayal and a real one. Defense attorneys argued that he had acted in the heat of passion, driven by a deep emotional wound. They claimed he had never intended to kill Claire, only to scare her, and that things had spiraled out of control in the moment. The court proceedings were painful for everyone involved. Claire's family sat in the gallery, grieving not only her death, but also the unraveling of her marriage, which they had thought was solid. Friends were called to testify about the couple's relationship, revealing cracks that no one had seen before. Meanwhile, the prosecution delved into Claire's online activity, dissecting her chats with Dark Knight, and playing excerpts in court to demonstrate how the relationship had grown increasingly intimate. Tom, shackled and hollow-eyed, listened as his life was laid bare. He admitted to reading the messages, but insisted he had loved Claire, even in the moments leading up to her death. His regret was palpable, but his remorse couldn't bring Claire back or undo the damage he'd caused. The court also heard from Dark Knight, whose real name was Evan. He testified via video call, visibly shaken by the situation. Evan explained that he had never intended to interfere in Claire's marriage. He thought she was just venting, a lonely woman seeking connection. He had never pushed for her to leave Tom or meet in person, though he acknowledged that their conversations had crossed emotional boundaries. The court and public alike scrutinized his role, sparking debates about whether online relationships constituted infidelity. As the trial continued, public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Tom as a villain, a man who let his insecurity and anger drive him to an unthinkable act. Others viewed him as a victim of a betrayal that had broken his spirit, arguing that Claire's emotional affair had been cruel and deceptive. Social media buzzed with discussions about the blurred lines of fidelity in the digital age, with people sharing their own stories of online connections that had shaken their relationships. In the end, the jury found Tom guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a punishment that felt both just and tragic. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the sentence was read, leaving behind a lingering sense of loss for what could have been. Tom's incarceration became a period of reflection. He spent his days poring over books, attending therapy sessions, and trying to make sense of his actions. Though he would never escape the guilt of taking Claire's life, he began to understand how his own insecurities and unchecked anger had fueled the tragedy. In letters to Claire's family, he expressed his sorrow and shame, but he knew forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a distant hope. Meanwhile, Claire's story became a cautionary tale. Experts and therapists use it as an example of how technology could strain relationships, highlighting the importance of communication, boundaries, and addressing emotional disconnects before they festered. The online world, they argued, wasn't inherently bad, but it could become a dangerous escape when real-life problems went unspoken. Evan disappeared from public view, shutting down his accounts and distancing himself from the chaos. For him, the situation was a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of emotional entanglements, even those that seemed harmless at the time. Years later, the story of Tom and Claire was still remembered, a stark reminder of how fragile relationships could be, how small cracks could grow into irreparable fractures, and how a single moment of rage could destroy multiple lives. It served as a chilling warning about the power of words, both spoken and typed, and the devastating cost of letting anger take control. As the years passed, Tom's life behind bars became a slow march of routine and reflection. He earned a reputation as a model inmate, teaching literacy classes to younger prisoners and mentoring those who struggled with anger issues. In some ways, helping others find peace became his way of atoning for the rage that had once consumed him. Yet, the weight of his actions never left him. Every night, he replayed the events leading up to Claire's death in his mind, searching for the moment he could have chosen a different path. Therapy sessions helped him understand the deep insecurities and unresolved issues that had driven his jealousy, but they also left him mourning the life he could have built with Claire if only they'd confronted their problems together. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on, but Claire's family remained locked in their own cycle of grief. Her younger sister, Maggie, had been the most vocal in her anger toward Tom, vowing she would never forgive him. Yet, as time wore on, her anger turned inward. She wondered if there had been signs she'd missed, ways she could have helped Claire before things spiraled out of control. In her heart, she couldn't reconcile the image of the loving, protective Tom she'd known with the man who had pulled the trigger. Eventually, Maggie began attending restorative justice workshops, seeking answers and perhaps some semblance of closure. She learned about programs that facilitated conversations between offenders and the families of their victims, and after years of internal debate, she reached out to Tom through a mediator. The meeting, held in a sterile prison conference room, was charged with emotion. Maggie entered with a mix of trepidation and resolve, while Tom, looking older and more frail than she'd imagined, sat with his head bowed. When their eyes finally met, the silence was deafening. "I need to understand," Maggie began, her voice trembling. Why couldn't you just walk away?" Tom's response was raw and halting. He admitted he didn't fully understand his own actions in the heat of that moment, but he spoke about the pain of feeling replaced, the helplessness of watching the woman he loved drift away, and the rage that had blinded him to everything else. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he begged Maggie to know that he regretted his actions every single day. For Maggie, the meeting was both painful and healing. Seeing Tom's remorse humanized him in a way she hadn't expected, though it didn't erase her grief. As she left the prison that day, she realized forgiveness might not mean absolving Tom of what he'd done, but rather releasing herself from the anger that had held her captive for so long. Claire's story also left an indelible mark on the broader community. Local organizations began hosting workshops on healthy communication in relationships, focusing on the challenges of navigating emotional infidelity in the digital age. Couples were encouraged to talk openly about their boundaries and vulnerabilities, addressing problems before they grew into crises. Claire's old friends and colleagues formed a support group for individuals grappling with the fallout of emotional affairs, whether as betrayed partners or those who had been tempted to seek solace outside their relationships. The group became a haven for people to share their stories and heal together, ensuring that Claire's memory wasn't defined solely by her tragic end. Years later, a journalist revisited the story, interviewing those who had been closest to Claire and Tom. Maggie, now an advocate for mental health and relationship education, spoke about the lessons she'd learned from her sister's life and death. Claire wasn't perfect, she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. None of us are, but what happened to her, to Tom, to all of us, it didn't have to end that way. If they'd been able to talk to each other, to really hear each other, maybe things would have been different. For Tom, the journalist's article was a bittersweet reminder of the life he'd lost and the woman he'd loved. As he read Maggie's words from his prison cell, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, not for redemption, but for the possibility that sharing their story might prevent another tragedy like theirs. In the end, the story of Claire and Tom became a cautionary tale, a painful reminder of the cost of silence, the dangers of unchecked emotions, and the fragility of human connection. It was a story that lingered in the minds of all who heard it, urging them to choose communication over assumption, patience over anger, and love over fear.